and good evening to everybody. And thank you, Lessig-san and Narita-san. Excuse me, I'm going to address everybody with last name and san in the Japanese style for a very, very powerful inputs. Based on your inputs and their own thoughts, there will be three commenters, people commenting on what you have discussed. So let me first invite Kurosaka-san to make his comments.
Presentations are very impressive. And this time, let me talk brief introductions and impressions in Japanese, because today there's many Japanese audience.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Kurosaka from Keio University. I was very much stimulated by the two speakers, and I'd like to talk a little bit about some practical things from my side. The two speakers talked about what is happening now, which is with the development of technology and penetration of technology and with innovation, that triggered these developments, what we see today, and the social system, including democracy, is being impacted so much by such developments. That was what was discussed by the two speakers. What we know, I'm sure that many people felt that this is something that they see for themselves as well, and this is bringing about serious change in our society today. Let me share my screen with you. I prepared my very simple slides. I'm a member of the faculty of Keio University and also have launched a small consulting firm named Kuwadate. What I do there is I assist companies who are in the telecommunications sector or in data business. I provide consulting services, and I also provide assistance to the Japanese government. As I do this work, recently, from newspapers and from TV networks, people in the media business, they come to us for assistance. What is common here? There are two things that are common. First is with diversification of media, traditional media is being placed in a difficult situation. And today, these traditional media, they are not rejecting and negating this diversity of media. They are themselves using SNS and the internet to do new things. But the trust structure that traditional media had before the arrival of the internet, that has been diluted. Ultimately, be it traditional media or media on new technology, in both instances, the trust in media overall is now being shaken, and this is something that people are worried about. In the past, we tried to solve this issue by enhancing media literacy of individuals. That was the traditional internet culture, but with the penetration of the internet and the technology to collect eyeballs has enhanced so much, getting people's attention. This is now being done at a very sophisticated level in the industry, and this is far beyond the ability of individuals. We won't be able to solve these problems just by enhancing the capabilities of individuals, because that is already beyond the ability of individuals. We are being exposed to trustworthy media and not trustworthy media. We cannot tell the difference between the two in today's world. Another thing, this is also a very similar phenomenon looked at from a different perspective, especially from the viewpoint of the industry. Recently, ad fraud is shaking the information distribution ecosystem on the internet. Mangamura is a illegal content site from Japan, is making so much money. They are infringing rights of the rights holders, and they also caused harm on advertisers. So internet technologies are being abused, and the digital media ecosystem is no longer functioning because of that abuse. Not just the publishers, not just the authors, but this is also having a major impact on advertisers as well. So the trust in media is being shaken. So the media is not functioning anymore. That is how people feel. And journalism that is placed on top of the media is jeopardized. So from an industrial issue, many people are sensing a crisis coming. And many of these problems come from technology. With the development of technology and by the abuse of technology, these things are happening. That is what our team has focused upon. We say OP. OP stands for Originator Profile. We make use of this technology to spread this technology, to try to solve these problems. That is what we have started to do. The idea here is very simple. Who the publisher is, the publisher that is publishing information, what kind of company is this, what kind of editorial policy does this company have? We make that clear through third-party certification. That's all. We don't go into the content of the articles. So this is not censorship. This article was written by Yomiuri Shimbun, or that article was written by New York Times. And Yomiuri Shimbun has this kind of editorial policy, and New York Times has this kind of editorial policy. Not just the publishers declaring themselves. We certify, or the third party certifies that this is an article written by this person with this kind of a profile. So by embedding this profile for each article, users can check that as they wish. Whether to get certified or not, or whether you will be placed on top of this service or not, it's up to the publisher. So we have no intention of imposing this on the publishers. But there are publishers that are trying to work on this kind of trust-enhancing mechanism. We wanted to make it clear to the end users who are willing, which publisher is willing to go through this certification. This should be done quite simple, but if you are to implement this on the web browser vendors or OS vendors such as Google and Apple, worldwide consortium would have to be a place where there's a lot of discussion to be held. There are difficulties. This is a simple idea, but we want to try to clarify where trust lies so that the end user can verify whether the other party is trustworthy or not. We're trying to build such a mechanism, whether we can do this in time, whether this can really try to solve the problem at hand. We want to take up this challenge. There are many things that are yet to be done. So I thought that we wanted to start from here. Japanese newspaper outlets, people in the ecosystem, we are trying to get their buy-in, and we're starting to start on this endeavor. And maybe next year I can talk about more specifics. So this is the kind of program that I'm working on. So this may be one solution to the problems raised by the two keynote speakers. That is all. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite Nakagawa-san to share his views.
See your slides as well. Since Dr. Lessig is with us, I think I should speak in English. So I'll start speaking in English.
Working at the RIKEN, which is a National Institute of the Science and Engineering, and AIT. AIT means Advanced Intelligence Project. Yeah. So thanks to your very insightful presentations, I'm always thinking about the crisis of democracy in today's situation, which is heavily relying on the internet, especially social network services such as Twitter, Facebook, and so on and so forth. Then my comments and questions relate to massive number of messages sent via social network services. Next slide, please. The first thing I'd like to mention, and I think the most dangerous thing, is so-called fake messages. As we saw in the last presidential election in the US, fake messages had a strong influence, especially from the Trump camp. The fake messages coming from pro-Trump people have very easily generated more QAnons. You know QAnons, of course, and strengthen these QAnons if I understand it correctly. The problem is the fake messages for one camp is regarded as a true messages for the opposite camp. This is what actually happened in the last presidential election. As a result, the distance between them, two parties, becomes wider and wider by faking each other with strong or even stronger languages. So the question is how to cope with this phenomena. It's a very difficult question, but it's seeming. I think it's. We should think about this kind of question to restore the democracy. So next slide, please. Many fake messages are copied from very small number of sources, as has been recognized. Then many people are very easily deceived and start to believe that the majority of people believe in what fake messages advocate. In other words, many people easily trust the fake messages. And what finally developed is a solid filter bubbles or echo chambers. Filter bubble phenomena causes a real threat to the democracy, I think. How to break their filter bubbles? The first thing is to make an informational environment to start communicating each other. Next slide, please. Many people might say that I am too optimistic, but I dare to say, my proposal is many people, including both camps, to communicating with non-controversial issues such as food, sport events, and so on and so forth. So my hope is that exchanging messages about non-controversial issues mitigate the situation, even though in a very small scale. For example, almost all Americans like an apple pie in the best of my knowledge. Then the apple pie comes to be the common ground to both camps. It might be a clue because sometimes non-controversial topic indirectly relates to the controversial issues. Indirectly, but certainly connected to the essential issues. So my question is, do you think this strategy works even though it is just a beginning? So the next slide, please. Here, I'd like to move to another topic, which is anonymization of social network services users. Anonymization of SNS has both positive and negative aspects, but for the purpose of making trusting each other, anonymization seems to be a big obstacle in my imagination. A bit extreme opinion, but I dare to ask, does it seem to be effective for restricting democracy to prohibit anonymization on SNS? However, it is not realistic from my many reasons. For instance, anonymity of SNS users helps them say real opinion via SNS because they are anonymous. If they use their real name and send messages of real opinions, they might get into trouble. Say, so many aggressive and hostile messages surge and get in the so-called flaming up situation. Do you have any insight about the bad effect of anonymization for democracy? And do you think prohibiting anonymization on SNS is effective or not to restore the democracy? The issue can relate to the Communications Decency Act in the US, if I don't misunderstand the act. In Japan, the secrecy of correspondence is very strong power not to reveal the sender's and receiver's name in public communications. But in my understanding, many guys misuse or even abuse the secrecy of correspondence and make too strong hostile messages on the internet. And these massive hostile messages generate so many victims that we see the news about these victims almost every day. On the other hand, regulation against messages violates the freedom of expression. So the question is, what is a good balance or middle way between free speech or freedom of expression and prohibiting hostile messages? Actually, after the mess of the last election, Twitter decided to ban the Trump camp's messages. Yeah. Yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nakagawa-san. Before moving on to the next commenter, I'm going to give advanced warning to Lessig-san that after Yamamoto-san's presentation, I will be asking you to comment on them.
Thank you. And I provided explanation of the purpose of this symposium. I am Yamamoto, Deputy Director of KGRI, and my area of expertise is Constitution, just like Professor Lessig. So I would like to comment from that perspective. Professor Lessig and Professor Narita, I should say Lessig-san and Narita-san, and both of the speakers spoke that democracy is jeopardized. I think it was common to both presentations. And I think the point of discussion will be how should we react? And one thing that we can say will be the interpretation of our constitution. We probably need to revisit that. And I have listed 3 points in my slide. The first one is the freedom of speech or expression. Do we need to redefine freedom of speech or expression? I would like to point this out. In the current SNS, just like Nakagawa-san mentioned, he used the expression of anonymized expression. Without having responsibility or liability, people are now able to express themselves. So without any ethical filters, it would be possible to express their emotions. Speech, what we need to protect as freedom of speech, and emotions, sentiments or acts, emotions and acts are becoming more mixed with each other. That is the kind of status. So once again, we probably need to revisit what expression, what freedom of expression is. And now emotions are becoming weaponized, and we always have smartphones with us, and we always have critics within our smartphones. In other words, we are always rearing criticism and having direct impact to our bodies. We have to live with them in a sense. So the meaning of speech, we need to redefine. For example, I wrote a neoliberal approach, the freedom to say whatever we want to, or would it be civic republican? Is it the kind of encumbered freedom in order to protect democracy? We need to once again revisit the purpose of the rights we have. And in relation to that, what would be the right to know? And I wrote it as the freedom of unbalanced diet, the freedom to eat as much as you want of your favorite food. Is that the case? Or is it supposed to be more of a balanced diet? And should that be close to the essential right to know? I wrote the term information health, but what does the right to know include freedom of unbalanced diet, or is the meaning of right to know more of having the balanced diet? We probably need to revisit that. And coming to the second point, in constitutional interpretation, we often talked about free market of ideas. Good ideas, bad ideas will not be determined by countries or states, but depending on the market theories that they will be determined. As Professor Lessig mentioned, in attention economy, in the end, critics or engagements, such information will be what. It's not a matter of what kind of ideas would be better, but it would be more of a competition of a market of stimulants. So from market of ideas, they are now shifting to market of stimulants. And if that is the case, it's not just simply depending on the market, but the governments or the states should intervene with the market and to make sure to have more functions to the ideas. And the third one is the freedom of mind hacking and cognitive process. Using data, users' psychological trend can be analyzed. And through that, a user's ideas may be manipulated or would be forced to addiction. It may be possible to do that. Professor Lessig talked about Facebook and the platformers. Some of the platformers are doing psychological profiling, and they're trying to enhance engagement unilaterally. There is a possibility that they do that. So against this kind of application of cognitive science, how should the constitution deal with that? Is this just about privacy? And we often introduce this as the cognitive liberty in Japan as well. But we need to defend the liberty within our mind. If we have time, we would like to ask this question to Professor Lessig. And one more point, this may be slightly deviating from constitutional interpretation, but against the weakening of democracy, I think there are technologies. I listed 3 points, and the first one is advertising algorithm we need to shift to public algorithm from advertising algorithm platformers. I won't say that all of them should adopt public algorithm, but the major platforms, for example, we have filter bubbles that are existing now, but we need to destroy, and we probably need to promote dialogues. For example, without having interest to social security, for those people who do not click social securities, we need to analyze, and we dare to send information to social security, but we should not send it just as something without any measure, but depending on the preference of the individuals, same news should be sent so that they will read them. For example, in case of a young generation, we should send in the form of videos about social security. In other words, from a slightly different perspective, it may be slightly different information, but it can be viewed by everyone, and this may be possible by public algorithm, or as one of the public algorithm, your own information health status may be visualized. Just like the health checkup, you may be able to check your health status, what kind of information you are taking or intaking needs to be understood. And because of time, I will skip number 2. And number 3, I just would like to say a word related to possibility and limitation to processing of expression. And because of a constitution, this may be relatively tense. For example, just like in the form of subtitles, one news, depending on readers, it may be arranged. For example, main channel and sub-channel, depending on the users, it may be possible to provide a multi-channel or the rightist language should be translated to leftist language, or the leftist language should be interpreted to rightist language. This may be another approach using artificial intelligence, not translating foreign language, although it's the same language. There are differences in ideas. In order to facilitate a better communication, it may be possible to have this kind of a translation. This is one of the method to create a public or we. And coming to the last point, I wrote a metaverse and a question mark is placed, but I'm not quite sure whether this will be successful or not. But we will be able to create a virtual space, and there a majority of our life will be dependent. And who will be the sovereign in the world? We need to revisit that. The private platformers may be able to create a code or algorithm, just like Professor Lessig said. So the range of constitution, we probably need to think about that. In other words, its constitution vis-a-vis state, but in the virtual world, if the sovereign is the private platformers, then we need to apply constitution to private platformers. In EU, this kind of approach is taken, but in case of the United States, constitution will not be for the platformers, but to state, and this will be applied to state. So how are we going to manage this? in terms of the relationship between platformers and states and the range of constitution. This would be another critical point. It was a little bit lengthy, but that concludes my comment. Thank you very much.
As we anticipated, we are short on time, but I want to, nevertheless, I would like to make as much interaction as possible. So let me first invite Lessig-san to respond to some of the things the commentators and as well as Narita-san made. I think they made a few very important remarks. So may I invite you to respond to some of the things that has been raised?
Sure, and I'm grateful for the comments, and especially grateful for the presentation of Narita-san, which is really profound and terrifying, and something which I need to spend some more time incorporating into my own work. But let me address the commentators directly. So Kurosaka-san, I like the idea, obviously, of providing an infrastructure for certification. The work that I did with Creative Commons is a similar kind of infrastructure for certification. It's a certification by a copyright owner that they have certain views about free culture that they'd like to attach to their creative work. And I think it would be an important experiment to see the extent to which it might improve the flow and dynamic of information. My concern in the United States is whether we understand the concept of trust in the same way. I mean, within the United States, do different groups trust in the same way? And you know, the assertion by one group that this is a trustworthy organization may itself render the organization untrustworthy by a different group. For example, when Facebook or Twitter would mark the comments of the president untrustworthy or false, that actually led many people to believe that they were more trustworthy or more likely to be true because those people didn't trust Facebook or didn't trust Twitter. So it might be that, you know, we're just at a stage of polarization that renders everything any solution useless. But that's the concern that I felt as I was listening to your very creative idea. Nakagawa-san, I too think that there's a very important distinction between, we could think of them as politicized discourses and unpoliticized discourses. My colleague Diane Gahan has done a lot of work about cultural cognition and evinced with very powerful empirical data that when it's a politicized discourse, people are crazy in their understanding of facts. But when it's a depoliticized or non-political discourse, they're quite sensible in their processing of facts. But the concern that I have is that given the incentives of the infrastructure of media, there's an incentive to take a non-political discourse and render it as political. So for example, in the United States right now, if you ask questions about the effect of cell phone radiation, that's not a politicized discourse. Republicans will be as skeptical as Democrats of claims. There's no Republican Democratic difference there. But I can imagine a network like Fox News Network that would say, it'd be useful if this were a politicized discourse. So let's work as hard as we can to render it political. Let's make it so people who question the safety of cell phones are left-wing loonies and only decent Republicans would ever think of the safety of cell phones as taken for granted, whatever. But the point is, if they make more money, the more things are politicized. I worry we have a built-in incentive to drive towards more things being politicized, and that weakens the capacity of this important block or friction on the infrastructure of craziness from having its real effect. But I agree with you. This is a dynamic that could make things much more balanced and effective. Yamamoto-san, obviously we come from a very similar background, so everything you said was I felt directly connected to, and I think it's very important to work through. I do think we're going to have a very significant need to reconceptualize the whole doctrine of free speech in this era. And the reason for that is free speech takes for granted the infrastructure of the mechanism for processing the value or the worth of speech. We're sitting around a table, everybody says their bit, we all can evaluate the credibility or the worthiness of the particular speech, and we make our judgments based on that. And in that context, the John Stuart Mill idea that the solution for bad speech is just more speech makes sense, because humans are making and processing and weighing the speech, and humans are pretty good at that because we've been doing it for a long time. But when the actual infrastructure for deciding which speech is elevated and which speech is suppressed is not humans, but these artificial intelligence machines, and when they are elevating speech or amplifying speech or suppressing speech, not on the basis of its truth, or even on the basis of its partisan valence, whether it's conservative or not, but simply on the basis of whether it will trigger engagement, then the whole manipulation engine of these artificial intelligence machines makes the society increasingly vulnerable to the consequences of that manipulation. I think your analogy to health or the unbalanced diet is exactly right. I mean, we have an industry. There's a great book, Salt, Fat, Sugar, Michael Moss, which describes the processed food industry. And the processed food industry, of course, like our worst export to Japan and the rest of the world, Kentucky Fried Chicken, which I know that you like very much around Christmas time, but is exactly this kind of processed food. The processed food industry has its own food science, and food science is the process of figuring out how to get the perfect mix of salt, fat, and sugar to make it so the food is irresistible. And of course, it's very good at doing that. And it makes things like Kentucky Fried Chicken or buffalo wings or whatever the food is, certain kind of chips and the like, irresistible. And you've got to really work hard not to eat too much of that or not to eat it at all. And the response to that is exactly the response of a healthy diet movement. Like, how do we discipline ourselves to eat in the right way? That's exactly the same dynamic that's going on with the information ecosystem. Tristan Harris and the Center for Humane Technology, as I described, are in the business of trying to evince the manipulation that's being effected through this science engineering people to be manipulated and responsive to this information content. Both of it exploits evolutionary weaknesses of humans, and both of them need to be resisted. And I think the fear I have in the United States especially is that these strong doctrines of the First Amendment will be invoked effectively to block the ability of governments to step in and do anything about this manipulation. Already leading scholars, some of them paid by Google in particular, have written articles that say the First Amendment bans the government from regulating or having any effect to regulate these algorithms because algorithms are just free speech. Well, if that's the conclusion, then we are really toast, because these manipulation engines are much stronger, much better than we are in understanding how to control us. And we are vulnerable if we have to turn ourselves over, our democracy over to them.
Leslie-san, before letting you go, let me mention one person from the audience picked on this is actually Narita-san's expression, but you mentioned that too, the weakening of democracy. And I think there is the question is whether democracy should be sustained or not. And I think I think I can elaborate this point to be a little bit different question of what is it that really needs to be protected. You said in relation to Yamamoto-san's comment that freedom of speech may not be the end goal, but the infrastructure. And you touched. It sounds like what you are really against is manipulation of people's mind. Sounds like what you are really against. But what is it that we really want to protect, or what is democracy when you say democracy?
I think the essential thing democracy tries to protect is the defense against concentrations of power. Okay. And the infrastructure of democracy is, if properly implemented, the best defense we have against the concentration of power. Now, we've never had democracy, perfect democracy. But I think Narita-san is absolutely right that we've seen the weakening of the institutions of democracy that we have had. At least let me just speak for the United States. The dramatic change between 1998 and today is really hard for people to grasp. I just published a piece in the New York Review of Books that tries to pull together all the dimensions of corruption of democracy that we have seen. And the familiar ones, like the role of money in politics, are just one. We've seen open suppression of the vote by political opponents, so Republican states making it harder for Democrats to vote. We've seen extreme gerrymandering to make it so that a party that doesn't control doesn't have a majority vote in a state actually controls the institutions of the state. We see it in the way the Electoral College works. We see it in the grotesque way that the United States Senate has become controlled by a tiny fraction. It could be states representing no more than 21% of America have the ability to block any substantial legislation in the Senate. All of these together have rendered, I think, the United States what we should call a minoritarian democracy, meaning the minority party actually has control over the government, even though it doesn't represent a majority. And all of those, I think, render the institution vulnerable to corrupt, powerful, concentrated institutions. So, the 2008 financial crisis is explicitly because of the connection the government had to these very small number of very powerful financial institutions on Wall Street that led to the deregulation that encouraged the kind of craziness that then exploded in that crisis. And I think all across the board, you can see in the United States how these very few are openly hostile to the idea of control by government. Look at Elon Musk, the richest man in the world by some measures now. Elon Musk openly taunting members of the United States government. So, Bernie Sanders tweeted something about taxing rich people, and Elon Musk tweeted back, "I keep on forgetting you're still around." And then Elizabeth Warren suggested that maybe Elon Musk should pay some taxes. And Elon Musk called her Senator Karen. So like this open contempt of the richest in our society for our government is just an expression of the fact that they have more power. They have more actual power to affect the world, to change things in the world than the processing of the United States Congress does. And I think that's a terrifying reality, confirming everything that Narita-san has said about what we need to fear.
Thank you very much. Now let me turn to Narita-san. We've been hearing two constitution lawyers advocating some kind of that the government should step in to modify the algorithm of the platform or other technologies in order, if I may borrow Lessig's expression, to protect against over concentration or minority hold of the power structure. What's your reaction to that? Is that included in your what to do or what not to do?
Sure. So instead of providing sort of detailed reactions to the three discussants, I'd like to sort of putting together pieces coming from the three discussions into some questions for Lessig-san. That is the short question is then what do you think we should do? That's the short question. But a longer sort of version is that I think so to deal with this problem of sort of broken democracy you summarized, I think that there are at least sort of three broad categories of potential sort of solutions and ways out. So the first group of potential solutions is the set of some potential interventions or regulations in the process of the flow of information and communication inside the media and the social media. And that's sort of related to what sort of Nakagawa-san and Kurosaka-san talked about. And the second category of sort of potential resolutions here is some sort of redesign of the electoral process and the design of elections. And that's sort of related to what you mentioned during your responses. And the third category of sort of potential solutions is the most sort of radical and wild one, that is sort of giving up on the current existing political institutions and countries and trying to trying to sort of invent some new country or some independent region where we can build up a new political institution, a more ideal political institution from scratch. And this is a sort of more Peter Thiel type science fiction solution to today's problem. And is also related to a point made by Yamamoto-san in the context of the emerging metaverse domain. And I was wondering sort of what do you think is the most sort of promising solution in this sort of spectrum of different ways out, given today's technological and political sort of situation?
Well, I think we have to do all three at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So with respect to regulations, I actually think the simplest regulation we ought to test, and it's hard to test in the United States because of the First Amendment, but the simplest one to test is a version of what's been suggested. It's basically to ban advertising in certain domains of of speech. So, you know, I think advertising in the commercial space is great. Like, I want to know which shoes I should buy, and I don't want to be steered to mountain climbing sneakers because I'm never going to climb mountains. And so that's fine. But in the context of political speech, the incentives that those advertising regimes, the surveillance capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff so nicely puts it, I think are destructive of democracy. And we could just intervene and say, like, turn the advertising engines off here. That's number one. Number two, we have to perfect the democracy, the institutions of democracy. I just think the simple way to understand is we have to end the corruption of those institutions. We have a pretty clear sense of what a representative democracy should be achieving. It should be giving everyone a relatively equal opportunity to affect democratic outcomes. And to the extent we fail to do that, and we fail absolutely in the United States, we ought to be fixing it. Third, I do think it's obvious that we're already trying to build new spaces. You know, they're not islands off of coasts of countries, they're virtual spaces. I'm very, Peter Thiel, somebody I've known for a long time. I'm very skeptical of Peter Thiel's politics here, but wonderful to see many different virtual spaces evolve that have different infrastructures of governance. I've been close to advising one, this really ambitious multiplayer persistent virtual universe. It's called SEED. That's a couple years out from development, but we've been talking about how do you embed infrastructures of self-governance within these virtual worlds. And I would love to be able to test these like different, like what, you know, if it's run like a democracy, is it better than if it's run by an autocracy? If it's a representative democracy, is that better than direct? You know, there's all these dimensions that you could just enable people to choose or to opt into, and then we could begin to see which ones work best. I think we have to do all of that because I think the crisis of where we are is very hard to miss. You know, people are credibly worried we're going to see a military a result after the 2024 election. There's a, you know, the high people of enormous respect think there's a 40% chance of that in the United States after 2024. And we have no time to waste in trying to pull together an understanding how to adjust each of these areas.
I must apologize to everybody that we are already out of time. But before closing, I think I'd like to give in the reverse order of the initial address. Each speaker, 49 seconds each to give the final comment. If you can, perhaps one thing we haven't touched upon very much is the role of journalism. We talked a lot about media, but not so much about journalism. So if you can touch upon that, I would really appreciate. But let me mention that there will be, Lessig-san is coming back in June. And we'll continue this talk. So I mean, originally we were supposed to talk almost an entire half day and evening. We only have 2 hours. So, but so 49 seconds each. So Yamamoto-san.
This is Yamamoto speaking. It's only 49 seconds, very short. It's about journalism. And I think the basic role of journalism is the surveillance of power, and how to see power is very important. Up to now, state power was basically the role of the journalism to supervise, but the platform power and the algorithm power, I think that the journalism is expected to observe them. The Facebook documents, mainly by Wall Street Journal, they are being reported. So I think this is a new role of journalism, which is the surveillance of the platform. And I think this is one of the evidence. Well, I think I already finished the 49 seconds, but about democracy, there are many things I wanted to mention, but in June, I want to discuss that. Thank you.
I will speak in Japanese. Democracy is very important. And in the end, platforms, GAFA, their power is so strong. And therefore, for them to become democratic may be a shortcut, maybe the easiest way. For example, in EU, there's GDPR, or AI Regulation Act has been enacted. And through that, GAFA is being impacted by those legislative acts. So a certain amount of democratization has been enabled. So through legislation, not just in the US, but in other countries as well, influencing GAFA, the platforms, to become more democratic, I start to think that that may be something that could be important.
Yes, from myself, I would like to communicate 2 concepts. The first one is a don't trust, verify concept, and the other one is a trust but verify concept. And when we discuss with the blockchain community, I was taught about this. But the role of journalism and the way of journalism, these will be the key points to consider over that. Don't believe but verify, or believe but verify. Journalism is not authority. Yet in our lives, we must trust, otherwise we will not be able to live in some aspects. So how are we going to live? We need to make sure to create a verifiable situation. I think this is extremely important. Whether we can progress step by step or not will be related to the soundness of journalism and democracy. Thank you. Thank you very much. Then Narita-san, please.
Just one final small thought, that is, so our entire discussion hints the importance of kind of sort of cooling down the engagement and communication and information in the social media, and slowing down it and verifying it and so on. And in a sense, so this is exactly what several autocratic governments have been doing. The Chinese government is doing that, and the Singaporean government is doing that in very sort of frightening ways. Then, so one big question is, how can we sort of distinguish our vision and our proposal from what these autocratic countries have been doing? And that's something I'd like to discuss more in June if there is an opportunity. But thank you so much for your time, Professor Lessig.
Thank you. Lessig-san.
Yes, I think slowing down is exactly the right metaphor. And indeed, in the health movement, there's something called the slow food movement that says that if we just cook your own food and eat it with friends, you'll process the food better. It'll be better for you. And I think that there's a slow democracy movement too, which is about slowing down the way we gather information and process information so we can do it at human speed. One of the most dramatic things in the Facebook files, the documents that Frances Haugen, whistleblower for Facebook, released from Facebook, is Facebook's own recognition that if it just limited the ability of people to reshare content twice, so if you get something and you reshare it once, then after that second reshare, you would have to copy the URL and paste it into a message. It just wouldn't be a simple reshare button. That you could eliminate more than 40% of everything they thought was misinformation on their network. And if you eliminated 10 share, even more than that, you could eliminate an even higher percentage. That's evincing the fact that it's just the speed in some sense, which is driving us to our craziness in much of this. And that's because the machines are running beyond our own capacity to process. So I think this is a nice metaphor, a slow democracy or slowing down. And they might have it right, even though they don't have, even though they're autocratic regimes.
Thank you very much. I think we have, thanks to the presenters and the commentators, I think we have a much better, I mean, a little clearer view of what the issues are, and some suggestions on where to go. I have to confess, I've been abstaining as a business major. I mean, like the biases business models are creating. I have a lot to say about that, but I'm going to keep that until June. And so we are waiting for Lessig-san. So please come.
Yeah, this has been one of the most intriguing sessions I think we've had since the founding, certainly, of the Cyber Civilization Research Center. I thank Lessig-san and everybody else for stimulating discussion, and join you in looking forward to it. Well, let me also take this opportunity to wish everybody a successful and peaceful New Year's. It's getting that time. In the early days of the development of the internet, many of us believed that ideas that were being developed there would provide an enriched mechanism to allow people around the world to talk with each other and thus to get to know each other. We hope that this would increase the prosperity of all the world and remove the lack of understanding that often leads to hostility and conflict. It's fitting at this time of a new year to reflect on these hopes and to work towards the goals that we hoped for many, many years ago. I hope next year allows us to again meet in person so we can gain the friendships and knowledge that this would bring. And I thank everybody very much for attending and for the presenters. Thank you.